They told me to stop calling, so I stopped letting them in. I was watching them on the little screen by the kitchen window. 3 cars, headlights cutting through the gray afternoon. The intercom buzzed. James, the retired officer I'd hired, stood by the iron gate with his hand on his radio, his face set the way it had been the first time he came to check the cameras, practical, polite, and not willing to be bullied. I could see Jennifer in the passenger seat, Michael in the driver's, Lisa in the back. They looked the way people look when they think a conversation is going to be quick and practical, heated under polite control. I already told them to stop calling, Lisa said into the phone, as if the cameras couldn't tell her own voice. Remove them, I said into the intercom. My voice was steady. It surprised me too, how small the syllables sounded and how enormous the meaning felt. Before that afternoon, before locks and letters and the quiet satisfaction of knowing my legal paperwork sat safe in Thomas Brennan's office, my life had been measured in ordinary things. The squeak of the van on the driveway when Richard pulled up on a Tuesday, the smell of tomato sauce simmering for Sunday dinners, the soft thud of a ballet shoe against hardwood when Sophie practiced in the living room. I raised 3 children in a modest house in Ohio, and I poured my best years into that pouring. I painted their bedroom walls, mended their knees, learned to make chicken soup that cured anything from a broken heart to a scraped elbow. I learned the sound of each child's breathing when they slept. I remember the ruby slippers we bought for Emma at a little downtown fair, how she insisted on wearing them to the grocery store like they were armor. Tyler, at 6, in a cardboard Darth Vader mask I'd helped cut out of an old delivery box, threatening to choke me if I stood between him and the popcorn at the Halloween movie. Richard working the garden after dinner while I pulled weeds and laughed, the kitchen warm and full of the smell of lemons and baking. We renovated a back porch together, his idea to raise it a bit, mine to paint it blue. When Richard got sick, we faced it like we faced everything, together. Then he was gone, and the house that had been 2 people's labor became the only place that reminded me of him. I kept the house, I kept the garden. It felt like loyalty and like oxygen. I paid the taxes, sent the checks, made the phone calls, and lived on the money Richard and I had put aside. I wasn't poor, I wasn't ostentatious either. I liked things fixed and useful. A kettle that whistled when the water boiled, curtains that actually blocked the sunrise when I wanted to sleep in. I believed, perhaps naively, that the work I had done, the birthdays, the graduations, the hospital sit-ins, would be returned with care when I needed it. I remember when the first little fissures appeared. It was nothing a stranger would notice. It started with calls that came later in the day, then texts instead of visits. Jennifer stopped dropping by for coffee after work. Michael, who used to mow the lawn with his father, sent a text asking for the name of my insurance agent. Lisa, who once called every night to read me a chapter from whatever novel she was obsessed with, began to suggest, almost casually, that maybe I should think about assisted living. "They're so comfortable now, Mom," she said. "They do everything. They have activities. You could make friends." The way she said friends was small and soft, like she was patting my shoulder to hurry me towards something she already wanted. I brushed it off at first. I told myself children were busy. I told myself these things happen as families age. People drift. They had jobs, children, mortgages. But then came the hospital scare, the night that shifted everything from small paper cuts to a clean, hard break. That night I felt a pressure in my chest that ate at my breath. It was the kind of pain that takes the shape of worry and makes everything else unnecessary. I called my neighbor, Mrs. Patterson, because she lives half a block away and always knows how to find a doctor. She came and sat with me, holding my hand until the ambulance arrived. I remember thinking how absurd and ordinary it was. Me, an EMT's gloved hand against my wrist, the fluorescent lights humming over a bed in a local hospital in Ohio. They kept me overnight for observation. It was cold and antiseptic, but also the kind of place where nurses move with practiced kindness. I was grateful for Mrs. Patterson and for the quick, easy competence of the emergency room. The smell of rubbing alcohol and the metallic taste in my mouth were small details I recall, with a kind of stunned affection for having been brought inside a system that, at least that night, was on my side. I expected calls. I expected someone to come, or at least to say, "How are you?" with urgency. I expected clumsy worry, the kind that tears up your voice when people are afraid and don't know how to steady themselves. What I got was texts that read like something written at a desk between emails. "Hope you're okay. Call later," Jennifer wrote. "Don't worry, Mom. You'll be fine," Michael texted, from 3 time zones away with a photograph of his dinner attached like an accidental apology. "I can't talk now. Call tomorrow," Lisa messaged, as if there were a schedule for my survival. It wasn't only the words. It was the tone. It was the pattern, absence masked as efficiency. Their responses were the kind people give when something is inconvenient. Perfunctory, brief, courteous. They offered reassurance that had the sincerity of a holiday card. I sat in that hospital bed feeling very small and very divided from them. I thought about nights staying up with feverish children, bringing them water, singing nonsense songs to make them breathe, patching skinned knees and egos. I thought about the times I had canceled my plans to sit with a child through a breakup, or to drive miles for a recital. I thought about the white-haired woman in the chair opposite mine, a woman who had no one to call, and I felt a chill. What if I was already on the other end of that phone? Someone would eventually stop answering. After that night, the conversations changed. The texts that followed were different. There were more questions about policy numbers, about whether my will was in order, about whether the house was worth what I thought it was. There were suggestions about downsizing, about how a smaller place meant less trouble for the people who would handle my affairs someday. They asked if I had the deeds, the mortgage papers, if my documents were organized. Lisa brought up, in a casual tone that felt like a scalpel, the value of the house. "We should talk about the house," Jennifer said once, after a weekend of generalized silent togetherness. "It's a lot of property. Have you thought about what you want us to do with it?" "What I want is to live in it as long as I want," I answered. There was heat in my voice. I surprised myself with it. I wasn't asking for permission. I was asserting a thing that had been true since Richard left his tools on the back porch and told me to keep the flowers from drowning. They didn't hear the heat. They heard practicality. To them, it was a conversation about logistics, not love. The pattern crystallized, a series of small, accumulating moments that formed an image I could no longer ignore. Conversations steering towards inheritance. Visits that correlated with weekends when the house might attract buyers. A remark here about taxes. A remark there about how difficult it would be for them if I needed in-house help. When I looked at all of it together, it read like a ledger. Numbers stacked where there should have been tenderness. I can remember with surgical clarity the morning I called Thomas Brennan. Thomas had been recommended by a friend from the senior center, the woman who runs the knitting group. He had a reputation for being straightforward and patient, two qualities I had learned to value above charm. When I walked into his office, I felt like the haystack of papers in my handbag suddenly mattered more than any other thing in the world. He greeted me like someone who had patience measured carefully into his day. He looked at me with steady eyes, asked about Richard, then asked me what I wanted. "What I want," I said, "is to be left in peace. Not for everyone to like me. I know those I raised will always have opinions. But to know that my home in the end will not be a bargaining chip." He listened. That is the kind of lawyer people want. Not one who rushes to impress with legalese, but one who listens to the moral shape of the problem and then lays out the practical options plainly. He explained things in sentences I could keep in my pocket.
An irrevocable trust means that once we put the house into it, you will still live there if you choose, but you won't be able to take it back out later. It can protect the property from being part of a probate fight, Thomas said. He used his hands like a carpenter shaping wood, calm and sure. A payable on death account is an account you keep. You control it while you're alive, and the money goes directly to the person you name when you die. It avoids probate, but it doesn't shield against everything, he said. Each time he introduced a legal tool, he gave me a one-sentence explanation in plain terms. He always added a gentle caution. Any of these steps can be contested in court. I'm not promising the impossible, Margaret. I'm saying this will make your wishes clearer and harder to overturn. That phrase, harder to overturn, was important. He never said uncontestable. He never promised absolute protection. That restraint reassured me more than grand guarantees could have. We planned methodically. It felt a bit like building a small fortress, using the best materials we could find without trying to turn my life into something it was not. First, we restructured beneficiaries. I asked that 40...
He again cautioned that it was not a magic barrier, that legal challenges could be brought, but that it created a higher threshold for disruption. We converted my main savings into payable on death accounts, naming Charity A and the Grandchildren's Trust in the proportions we'd decided. Thomas wrote the clauses plainly and read them back to me in a voice that made me feel like the author of my own sentences.
He suggested incentive trusts for the grandchildren, with conditions that required effort: letters home, visits, and participating in family counseling. The idea felt like a small moral architecture, rewards for relationships, not just for standing in the right place at the right time when nobody was watching. Consult an attorney in your area about how this applies specifically, Thomas said, when I asked if I should do something similar for someone listening at home. His voice was gentle and professional. This is what I did for you. Laws vary. I wrote it into my notebook like a line to be repeated. Consult your attorney. I also took practical steps to protect my space. I installed cameras that would show the driveway and the walkway, a better lock on the front door, and, yes, the iron gate. It startled the mailman the first time I asked him to leave packages at the side door and not ring the bell. I hired James, the retired officer, to check in sometimes. He was discreet and kind. His presence felt less like an imposition and more like a promise. You won't have to do anything, he told me, and I believed him because he brought with him the kind of decency that put things in order without making them into theater. I also drafted a notarized letter. It is a strange, intimate sort of document to write. A name and then reasons, in the plain language of an adult who has been hurt and does not want to be misunderstood. I wrote what I remembered: the nights I sat up, the things I did, the ways love was given and taken. I didn't aim to indict anyone individually so much as to explain why. For the sake of my own peace, I was choosing these measures. I offered an offer: family therapy as the path to restoration. I offered reconciliation if there was a genuine effort, and I spelled out that the trust structures and the distributions were not meant to punish but to protect. It felt odd to think of love in legal terms, a thing with clauses, but I had learned, painfully, that affection does not always show up in the actions we expect. Sometimes love arrives as silence. Sometimes it arrives as a canceled visit. Sometimes it arrives as a question about policy numbers when you are lying in a hospital bed. After the papers were signed, Thomas folded them with the kind of care a person gives to fragile things. "These will make your instructions clear," he said. "If anyone wants to dispute them, they'll know exactly what you intended." He did not say they wouldn't fight. He did not promise smooth waters. He said the truth. Clarity helps. There was relief, and with relief came a strange lightness I had not expected. I started to do some things I had postponed for years. I joined a book club at the community center, where I discovered to my surprise other women my age loved the same quiet pleasures: a well-made cup of tea, a line of prose that felt like company. I took a painting class because something in me remembered the joy of color from childhood art projects, and even though the landscapes I painted were clumsy at first, I liked them. I volunteered a few afternoons at a local women's shelter in Ohio, teaching basic budgeting classes. It was work that felt useful and honest, a small exchange of learning for gratitude. Mrs. Patterson came over more often. We ate soup on chilly afternoons and traded stories about neighbors and grandchildren. There was a new rhythm to my days that felt like breathing slowly after holding my breath too long. In that softening time, I found friendships that did not carry ledger lines. There was laughter again, which felt both like mending and like a new strand of life. But the old habits and the old expectations did not vanish. They gathered like clouds. 2 weeks before Christmas, I got a message that made my stomach tighten. "We're coming over for the holiday," Jennifer wrote in a group text. "We want to spend it with you." It sounded on its face like the thing I had hoped for. My heart did a small, stupid hop. I thought of the carols, of the way my living room looked with low lights and the poinsettia on the mantel. I thought of making a big pot of stew and baking cookies shaped like stars. But there was a voice in the back of my head that had learned to listen to patterns. When these 3 children came together under one subject, my holiday plans, there was often more in it than the pleasure of being near me. I told James when he came by to check the cameras. "They say they're coming for Christmas," I said. His jaw tightened, an expression that made me respect him further. He asked a few practical questions. Did I want him to be there? Was I comfortable with the gate? Did I want the intercom to record? I said yes to the things that felt like a rational plan, and no to anything that smelled of war. I printed another stack of certified letters Thomas had prepared, 1 copy of the final estate instructions, 1 copy of the notarized explanation, and 1 copy of the family therapy offer. Thomas had suggested sending them by certified mail so there was a record, and I arranged for the post office to do that the following day. It's not about escalation, Thomas told me when I mentioned the letters. It's about transparency. You want them to understand that this is thoughtful, not impulsive. I folded the letters and slid them into envelopes with a calmness I did not earlier possess. In the back of my mind, I kept hearing Lisa's voice, that little phrase she used like a scissor. Stop calling.
I thought of every time I had stayed up sewing Halloween costumes until midnight, and every time I had driven hours to hold a child after a breakup. I thought of the hospital night and the thin, efficient texts. My fingers trembled when I sealed the last envelope, not from fear, but from the knowing that the next steps would not be gentle and that they would be necessary. When the certified letters went out, the rhythm at the house shifted. The cameras blinked more often. The gate lock made a noise I now welcomed in the quiet of night, and James came a little more regularly. It was small and domestic, the ways you prepare for a storm. Board the windows, buy an extra bag of flour, make sure the flashlight has batteries. My friends at the book club asked how I felt. Mrs. Patterson brought over a casserole and said simply, "You did what you needed to do." They did not come immediately. There was a week of waiting that felt like the hour before a powder keg goes off. Not loud, but charged. Michael's calls became curt, then occasional. Jennifer sent a message asking if we could talk about things when they arrived, and Lisa changed her profile picture to a family photo, like a promise or a claim. I spent evenings painting and listening to a radio that played old songs, Frank Sinatra and Patsy Cline, the way a person holds on to familiar companions in a house that has been its own witness for decades. I prepared the house in ways that had nothing to do with law and everything to do with dignity. I ironed the tablecloth we'd used for decades, set out the good plates, put fresh bulbs in the lamp by the sewing chair. I wanted the house to feel like home, even as it became a place where boundaries were drawn and upheld. There is a dignity that arrives when a person refuses to make themselves small to accommodate other people's greed. It is not loud. It is not spectacle. It is quiet as a closed drawer. On a cold morning, with frost on the porch and a sliver of sun breaking the sky, the 3 cars came up the lane. I saw them first on the monitor, then through the window as they pulled into the circle by the gate. My hands folded idly in my lap. James stood by the ironwork, his posture composed. Mrs. Patterson, bless her, had come by with a thermos of coffee and a small plate of cookies in case things turned sour. Her presence was, in its way, more powerful than any legal document, a public witness to the truth of my life. They got out of their cars the way people get out when they think what waits is conversation. They laughed too loudly at a joke. They adjusted their coats, the motion of families trying to appear casual before business. The intercom crackled. "This is Margaret," I said when the voice came through, and my voice was steady, because I had spent months making it so. No hard feelings. I'm offering family therapy. I'm not closing a door, as long as it's necessary for my peace. The answers I received were the ones I had been building against, rehearsed, brisk, a mixture of entitlement and hurt. They tried, in sharp practice turns, to push past courtesy into pressure. The scene that followed is not one I will yet narrate. It is something I am saving for the moment it must be told in full. For now, in this pause before the moment becomes spectacle, I felt only the slow, clear sense that what I had done was not vindictive, and that I had, for the first time in many years, chosen my own steadiness. For the first time in a long time, my breath did not hitch. It was a small thing, the steadiness inside my ribs, and I felt grateful for it. The monitor showed them pacing. The intercom light blinked when someone pressed the call button again and again, as if repetition would make the answer different. "Mom, open up, it's Christmas," Jennifer's voice said through the crackle. It tried for warmth and landed somewhere like a rehearsed line. "This isn't about the holiday," I answered, and my voice held the shape of every quiet decision I had made in the last months. I have sent the letters. I have offered therapy. I am asking for time and respect. There was a rustle of coats and a pause. I could hear Michael taking a breath like someone who was preparing an argument. Lisa sighed, the soft impatience I knew like a second language. Then Jennifer spoke again, sharper this time. "You can't just shut us out, Mom. After everything—" "Remove them," James said into his radio, and the words came without show. They were not given with malice.
They were given with the authority of someone whose job it was to keep things orderly and safe. "I told you, Margaret," he added aloud for the intercom, easy and clear. "We need to keep the gate closed unless you want them in. That's the arrangement." There was a scramble of voices on the other side. Something about rights and family, and "you can't do that," threaded through the air. They walked the perimeter as people do when they believe their entitlement is a map rather than a plea. Jennifer pressed her palm to the gate and leaned forward so her face filled the tiny camera lens. Through the monitor, it looked absurdly intimate and simultaneously obscene, like she wanted to peer into the place where my life still lived. "Listen to me," she said, and for a moment she sounded like the woman who used to pick the weeds from the flower beds with my hands in the soil. "You're scaring the kids. This isn't who you are." "Who's scaring whom?" I asked. The question was simple. It had a small, hard center. I thought of hospital lights, of perfunctory texts that translated worry into convenience, of the ledger that had been formed in their words. Who had walked away, and who had built a wall only because someone kept knocking with gloves on their hands? They tried to push. Not violently. They did not break anything. They leaned on the gate. They banged in frustration.
Michael shoved the iron with an elbow as if brute force might rearrange loyalty. He banged and cursed, and there were words I will not repeat here because they serve no purpose beyond heightening a wound. Lisa filmed his face with her phone in the way people film storms, as if documentation could become proof of a righteousness they already believed in. James stood between them and the house like a hinge. He did not shove. He did not raise his voice. He reminded them calmly that the property was private and that the gate represented a choice I had the right to make. Occasionally, he turned his radio and muttered something to the security team, the kind of small, efficient coordination you get from someone who has spent decades de-escalating heated situations. "You're not listening," Jennifer shouted. "We love you. You know we do." "I don't doubt you think you do," I said. "I just don't believe your actions match the claim." For 2 hours they circled and spoke. I sat at the window with the kettle warmed twice and a plate of cookies untouched. Mrs. Patterson, who had taken the thermos back to James and come in to sit with me for a while, kept one hand folded over mine. She looked at me as if I were a force of nature she had learned to respect. There's a certain kindness in a neighbor who treats your choices as if they are part of your health plan, necessary, sensible, and not to be negotiated out of you by anyone else. They left at dusk, not in a crack-the-door-and-grin way, but in the honest, messy way of people who have been refused and decide to turn their anger into departure. They drove off down the lane with headlights cutting the evening. Jennifer sent a last text as the taillights disappeared. "You'll hear from our lawyer," it said. The tone was a kind of valediction that assumed the world was divided between winners and badly behaved losers. True to form, the days that followed were full of noise that had little to do with grief. Their messages came in measured waves, an angry voicemail, a blistering email, a handful of text messages that were exercises in rhetorical fury and entitlement. There were calls to Thomas. There were, as Thomas had cautioned might happen, threats about contests, whispers about undue influence, suggestions that perhaps an older person could be pressured into decisions. The familiar caution in his voice at those moments steadied me more than anything else. They can contest. They may. Contesting is costly, and courts don't guarantee outcomes. We will keep good records. We will make your intentions clear. We did what he advised. We kept copies of everything. We logged calls and messages. James kept a journal of the days he stood watch. I saved emails and texts. The certified mail receipts were in a folder with the stamped envelope and the glossy ink that meant the post office had been there and that the letters had been delivered and signed for.
Thomas reminded me, gently, that clarity is a kind of defense. That is what the notarized letter, with its plain sentences about small hurts and larger patterns, had become. Not a weapon, but a written testament to the intention behind a decision. There were barbed efforts to intimidate. Twice a week for a while, reporters called asking to hear both sides, as if my life were a public spectacle. I declined. Thomas advised the same. Don't feed the hunger for drama. There were social posts with vague, performative grief on their accounts. People clicked like a kind of currency and moved on. There were also a few friends of the family who called me and asked, quietly, if I was all right. That gentleness felt like the thinnest of blessings. One morning, a week after the gate scene, Michael left a message that was mostly controlled fury. "We're going to contest the trust," he said. "We have reason to believe you were pressured. We know people who can help." He sounded, briefly, like a man afraid of loss, not only financial, but the alteration of his story. I listened to the message twice, closed my eyes, and then turned the radio to the classical station so something steady could roll through the house like warm honey. You did the right thing by documenting, Thomas said when I told him. Record everything. Limit contact for a bit if that keeps things less heated. If they dispute, we will respond. Courts care about timing, capacity, and whether there was undue influence. You were clear when you signed. You were calm. You notified them. That shows intent. I liked the way he said intent. It sounded like the word that gathered all the messy emotions and turned them into evidence. I liked that he treated me like a person with the capacity to mean. He never infantilized my choices. He never folded me into stereotypes. He recognized agency and gave it back to me in the form of documents and an explanation of their limitations. He reminded me that the law is porous. It is made by people who make mistakes, and it is not a shield against all pain. But it is a structure, a map, and a map is useful when you are finding your way out of a place you have waited too long in. They sent a lawyer's letter that was thin on facts and thick on threat. It accused us of isolating family members and hinted at elder abuse in ways that made my stomach twist with indignation and sorrow. Thomas took the letter, read it, and then translated it into the pragmatic English of legal work. They're trying to make the emotional case into a legal one, he said. We respond with documents and dates. We show capacity. We show counsel. We show that this was planned and that you made choices with an attorney who explained the implications. And that is what we did.
Thomas prepared a calm, pointed reply that laid out the timeline, included the notarized letter, and reaffirmed that my choices were not sudden acts of retribution, but deliberate efforts to protect the life I wanted to lead. He included the offers of family therapy and made clear I remained open to reconciliation if it was sincere and not merely performative. The response was not dramatic. It did, however, have the effect of lowering the decibel level slightly. People who had been sounding their alarms were asked, by the law, to provide details. That slowed some of the heat. It did not heal everything. The week slowed into a kinder rhythm. The book club debated a novel about family and exile, and then decided to host a small holiday potluck for anyone who might be alone. The painting class organized a show at the community center, and I sold one landscape to a young woman who promised to hang it in a place where she could remember to breathe. I volunteered mornings at the shelter and came home smelling faintly of coffee and the paperwork of other people's lives, which is to say I came home feeling useful instead of depleted. When Mrs. Patterson and I sat with our hands folded over a shared bowl of soup, I felt a peace that was not the absence of trouble, but the presence of people who had chosen to stay. Christmas arrived quiet and warm. There were fewer tinsel expectations and more honest, small pleasures. Mrs. Patterson brought her potato salad and an extra thermos of coffee. The book club friends brought mince pies and an old record of carols. James brought a small wreath he had made with his wife the summer before, something robust and no nonsense. We set the table with the good china, because dignity, I had learned, was as much about the small courtesies you give yourself as it was about legal maneuvers. Sophie and Emma, the grandchildren, sent a bouquet of hand-drawn pictures, stars and stick figures and a dog with too many legs. Tyler left a voicemail with a reading of a poem he had written for me in his shaky teenage voice. It was not a perfect family portrait. It was, however, loud with presence. There were, of course, messages from the children. Jennifer asked once again to meet somewhere neutral. Michael sent intermittent notes about paperwork he claimed to be concerned about. Lisa texted photographs of the house with captions that suggested grievance. I responded with a single sentence when I felt it necessary. Thomas has my records. I remain open to therapy. That is the path back.
If you are sorry, I told them once, slowly, then show it. Speak to a counselor, visit, be present. That is how you make amends, not by trying to undo documents after the fact. They did not show. They complained instead. They posted angry letters on social media about how elderly parents are difficult and set in their ways. People who had known me for years called to say they'd seen the posts and felt bad. The whole thing had the odd sensation of being on public display, private grief made into a performance for neighbors and distant acquaintances. I kept my head down. I kept painting. A few months later, in early spring, I received the sort of call that used to be ordinary and now felt like a remnant. Sophie wanted to talk about art class. Emma wanted me to come to a recital. Tyler asked, shyly at first and then with a courage that surprised me, if he could come by and help weed the back garden. The grandchildren's trust had been one of the hardest things for me to decide on because it felt like putting conditions on love. But in the end, I wanted to coax real relationship out of the rebel of convenience. The conditions were simple and gentle: an occasional visit, a letter on birthdays, and attending family therapy sessions at key ages. They were not contractual in a harsh way. They were an invitation to a practice. When Sophie asked about painting lessons, I felt the warm, small light of possibility. We scheduled a Saturday afternoon. She came with 4 brushes and a resolution to try. Emma played hush and clap for the recital and introduced me to her friends afterward like I was a talisman. Tyler came to the garden with sneakers full of mud and a face that looked older and more vivid than the photographs. Those weekends smelled like lemon oil and dirt and the kind of laugh that mends. It did not erase the past, but those moments taught me that younger hearts are capable of change, and that change sometimes takes time and a structure that is hard to ignore. The trust did what I hoped it would. It created a reason to build a bridge that the grandchildren could walk across if they wished. It did not force their hand. It simply offered a framework for choosing presence. The children, however, continued to posture and threaten in the background. Threats of litigation were common in angry seasons, and to be fair, my choices had risks. Thomas reminded me, sometimes gently, sometimes with the weary tone of a man who had seen many similar dramas, that people rarely like to be reduced by their own privilege. They will test boundaries until boundaries hold. He filed a response to one of the more aggressive letters and reminded me that courts look at clear timelines. He paused often to explain what certain filings might mean and what they would not. He never turned my life into a legal battleground for sport.
He was careful and steady, and for a woman who had feared being rendered small in her later years, that steadiness was an arm around the back. There were quiet victories I cherished. The house did not change hands, the garden still grew, the porch still creaked in the place Richard had nailed the boards. I became known in my small town in Ohio as the woman who had closed a gate and then opened her life to those who had chosen to stay. It was an odd sort of reputation. Some people thought me hard. Some people thought me wise. Mostly they thought I had picked one thing, dignity, and would not bend it for convenience. Months later, after the dust had settled into a tolerable pattern, Jennifer reached out with a message that read simply, "Can we try therapy?" There was in the phrasing the carefulness of someone who had tasted loss and perhaps wanted a different flavor. I replied, "Yes, when you are ready with sincerity, I am willing." She sent another message an hour later. "Not now," she wrote. "We don't want to reconcile under threat of money. That isn't sincere." I read her words and felt the old ache that never fully leaves. It is the ache of a mother who recognizes in the face of her children both the people who fed and protected and the people who moved away as soon as a new convenience appeared. I thought of the way Lisa once insisted I consider assisted living as though it were a present she was trying to sell. I thought of the many small moments that had created a ledger. Then I thought of the life I had now: painting classes, friends who called me to meet for tea, a house that smelled like lemon oil and fresh paint. "I accept your decision," I replied at the end of the week. "My offer of therapy stands. I will not change the estate because someone says they are sorry without actions to show it." It would have been simpler to rage, simpler to fold and let the house become an estate that resolved who I was into an inheritance, simpler to allow the old patterns to dictate the final months. Instead, I continued to make decisions that honored my life rather than my old wounds. I met with neighbors, helped set up a food drive through the community center, taught a budgeting class at the shelter, and spent slower evenings with Mrs. Patterson listening to songs that made the past feel less sharp. There were moments when I still expected a phone call in the middle of the night, a clumsy worry text. That did happen sometimes, but mostly there was a different kind of contact now. Postcards from Sophie from college, an invitation from Emma to sit in the front row of her recital, Tyler dropping off a bouquet of wildflowers he had picked from the side of a road. Those small, earnest actions mattered more than grand gestures because they were consistent. One spring evening, as I watered the tulips on the back porch, I thought about the word boundary, the way you think about a new pair of glasses.
At first, it's awkward, and you keep taking them off to make sure they will not define you. Then, slowly, you realize they bring the world into clearer focus. Boundaries are not fences that keep people out.
sometimes they are fences that keep you in the sense of keeping you inside the life you want to have. They are, in their best form, a kindness to the self. I do not tell this story for victory. I tell it because it is what happened. A woman who chose clarity over sorrow, who let a gate stand as a boundary instead of a prison. I made legal choices not to punish, but to protect. I set up trusts and payable on death accounts and an irrevocable trust for the house, so my intentions would not dissolve into confusion when I was not able to speak for myself. I had Thomas help me. He explained every step and reminded me that the law is not magic. He told me to expect resistance, and resistance came. It nearly always does when people feel they might lose something they have considered their due. To anyone watching who has felt the thin sting of estrangement or the quiet calculus of being seen as an asset rather than a person, I will say this gently: you have the right to choose peace. The means to achieve that look different for everyone. For me, it was legal paperwork and a gate and a notarized letter that spelled out the pattern I'd been living in. For someone else, it may be simpler conversations and clearer expectations. Consult your attorney if you think legal steps are right for you. I am telling you what I did. I am not telling you it is the only way. When the holidays came around again the next year, I invited people who had chosen to stay. The house smelled of stew and citrus. There were garlands on the mantel and a playlist of old favorites. James brought his wife. Mrs. Catterson baked mince pies and laughed when I mispronounced something on the recipe card. The grandchildren came and told jokes that made the cat look at them with suspicion. The children, Jennifer, Michael, Lisa, were not there. They had not declined with a letter. They had simply stayed away. I lit a candle for the man who had taught me to plant tomatoes so deep they would root into stubbornness. I set a place at the table for the memories that were gentle and complicated. I did not need my children to be there for the night to be beautiful. Chosen family can be whole. It can be repairing. It can be small and stubborn and warm. People often ask me if I regret being so firm. Did it cost you your family, they ask, with the curiosity of someone who has not yet had to put a border around their own peace. My answer is honest and uncomplicated. I regret only that it took so long to notice the pattern and to do something about it. I regret the nights I stayed silent when a clearer word might have helped. But I do not regret the choice to protect the life I have left. There is a line I have found between surviving and living, and I chose living.
If you are listening from somewhere in Ohio or beyond, tell me where you are watching from in the comments below. It helps me feel less alone in this wide world. This story is not a manual. It is a testimony. It is a record of how one woman in her 70s decided that dignity and safety are not luxuries, but necessities. I used legal tools I learned about with Thomas Brennan. We made decisions about percentages so that 4/10 of my estate would support older adults, 3/10 would go to scholarships, 2/10 would encourage the grandchildren to practice presence, and the final 10th would go to my friend Mrs. Patterson to see to small repairs and the last hospitality. Those numbers were meaningful to me because they expressed where my values had shifted, toward community, toward giving where the return is not measured only in money, but in lives helped. If you find yourself in a similar place, first, breathe. Then, find someone you trust to walk with you. Talk to an attorney who will listen and explain without grand promises. Keep records. Be clear about your intent. And remember that choosing peace for yourself is not a betrayal. It is an act of care for the person you have been and the person you still want to be. I did not close my life. I opened it differently. I let go of the expectation that people must act according to a story I once wrote for them. I kept the house that Richard and I had built out of work and love. I kept the garden that taught me to get my hands dirty and my heart honest. I kept company with the people who stood by me when it mattered. I kept the dignity of my last years, and in doing so, I found a steadiness I had not had before. If this story touched you, if it made you think of something hard in your own life, share it. Subscribe to hear more stories about ordinary people who choose something steadier than resentment. And if you feel called, leave a note in the comments about where you're watching from. Not to crowd the narrative, but so we can remind each other that none of us has to go through these things alone. I will end the way I began. I closed the gate because no one should be treated like an estate to be negotiated while they are trying to breathe. I did it for peace. I did it with care. I did it so my last years might be lived on my terms.
surrounded by people who chose to stay.